Right, so the BBC is in even more trouble, and they aren't alone in that either, as our hopelessly pathetic PM Keir Starmer shows he's even more of a weakling on the world stage than previously thought, having had a rather humiliating visit to the US to kiss the dayglo orange rear end of the pumpkin-tinged President of the United States, Donald Trump. What is connecting the two here, though, is the further fallout still ongoing from the BBC's decision to pull its excellent documentary Gaza, Life in a Warzone from its iPlayer streaming service at the behest of pro-Israel lobby groups, and its refusal to restore it, not only shining a light on the rampant pro-Israel bias that has infected the BBC, but with hundreds of well-known media figures having called out the BBC's bias, amplifying that fallout further. But by wading into this debate as well, Keir Starmer has once more demonstrated his own pro-Israel leanings in the most repulsive manner possible, but by doing so has highlighted the reality of how bad things have gone for him in the United States with Trump as well, despite many a mainstream headline saying otherwise. Both BBC and Starmer getting trounced all in one go. What's not to love? They deserve it, don't they? Right, so the BBC has for so many years been regarded as a bastion of impartiality and journalistic integrity, a cornerstone of British culture and a global standard for public service broadcasting. Certainly this is how they'd like to still be seen. But in this era of social media, this era when so many news alternatives exist now, the BBC has, well, slid in the reputation stakes significantly, let's put it, in recent years especially, and the real biases that exist there have become more and more obvious, and as such, more and more people have simply switched them off. One area even I would still hail the BBC as world leading in, though, is in its capacity to make fantastic documentaries. This has been a saving grace when its reputation has suffered so much in relation to current affairs, I feel. Yet they've now damaged their reputation on this score as well, possibly irreparably. The BBC's recent decision to remove the documentary Gaza, Life in a Warzone from its iPlayer streaming service, coupled with its refusal to restore it, has sparked widespread condemnation and raised serious questions about the broadcaster's commitment to impartiality. The fallout from this decision has not only damaged the BBC's reputation, but has also exposed the deep-seated pro-Israel bias within the organisation more than ever before, and the political pressures that sustain that, given the Zionist governments both now in power and before Starmer's Labour have had on it, and how those same pro-Israeli figures have pervaded the organisation's upper echelons as well. But at the same time that this fallout has been amplified by a recent letter signed by a who's who of the well-known and extremely angry Labour leader Keir Starmer's comments expressing concerns about pro-Palestine bias at the BBC, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, have further inflamed the controversy, exposing again his own unapologetic alignment with pro-Israel interests, and hilariously by doing so has shone an even greater light on his weakness in response to Donald Trump over in the US. But let's start by returning to that documentary Gaza, Life in a Warzone. The fallout from this for the BBC still very much being felt, which I covered in another recent video, which has provided a harrowing and deeply humanising account of the daily struggles faced by Palestinians from the perspective of the children living in Gaza, living under Israeli occupation and military bombardment. It highlighted the resilience of these kids, the devastation wrought by repeated airstrikes, and the systemic violence and deprivation that defines their lives in the besieged strip. And the film has quite rightly been praised for its empathetic and unflinching portrayal of a reality that is often being obscured or misrepresented in mainstream media, and not least by the BBC themselves. And if you can find a copy of this video online, it is being shared quite widely despite the BBC ban on it. I highly recommend giving it a watch if you can. But this sort of programming is where the BBC is at its best. However, it has sadly served to remind us that the pro-Israel bias at the BBC clearly rules over everything, since the BBC abruptly removed the documentary from its iPlayer platform, citing concerns about impartiality and contextual accuracy. This decision came, of course, after sustained pressure from pro-Israel lobby groups, the usual suspects who have nothing better to do than campaign for Israel no matter what they do, and who accused the documentary of being biased and one-sided. Well, it was a documentary about life in Gaza from the perspective of Gazan children, so there's no both sides in this really. What they say is what goes. So for one, it was only examining one side of this Israel-Gaza conflict, and there wouldn't have been a peep from any of these groups if this was an Israeli-focused documentary. And for two, it's a group of kids. How pathetic have you got to be afraid of what a child might say about what they're observing and what they're living through every day? Well, the removal sparked immediate outrage, of course, as it should, amongst journalists, proper ones that is, activists, and of course the general public, who saw it as an act of censorship and a betrayal of the BBC's public service mandate, which of course it is. If you pay the licence fee, you expect to be served accordingly by the service you fund. Yet we get propagandised instead more and more because the BBC is unable to be impartial. It isn't allowed to be, clearly, in response to this documentary. The backlash has been justifiably swift and damning for it getting cut, though. Over 700 media professionals, including prominent filmmakers, journalists and academics, signed an open letter organised by Artists for Palestine UK, condemning the BBC's decision as dehumanising censorship and a disgraceful act of complicity in the erasure of Palestinian suffering. Signatories included renowned figures such as filmmaker Ken Loach, actress Miriam Margolyes and author Naomi Klein, who have accused the BBC of bowing to political pressure and perpetuating a narrative that marginalises Palestinian voices. The letter is damning, a brief excerpt of it stating, "By removing this documentary, the BBC is not only silencing the stories of Gaza's children, but also reinforcing a systemic bias that dehumanises Palestinians and legitimises their oppression. This is not impartiality, it is complicity." The signatories call on the BBC to restore the documentary immediately and to uphold its commitment to journalistic integrity and freedom of expression. But that has been ignored. The BBC's justifications for removing the documentary have been widely criticised as disingenuous and flawed, which is a rather polite way of putting they've been lent on. In a statement, the broadcaster claimed that the film lacked sufficient context about the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict and failed to provide a balanced perspective, but then you were talking to kids and getting kids' perspectives on this. So I'm very sorry that they don't understand necessarily the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic at play here that the BBC must always represent at all times. And besides which, critics have pointed out that this reasoning is both hypocritical and inconsistent with the BBC's treatment of other documentaries and news coverage. For example, the BBC has frequently aired programmes and documentaries that focus exclusively on Israeli perspectives, often without providing equivalent context about Palestinian experiences or the historical roots of the conflict. This is quite obviously a two-faced double standard, a double standard that underscores the BBC's pro-Israel bias and its reluctance to challenge dominant narratives that favour Israel's political and military interests, and taken together with the complaints received, is an organisation, therefore, that comes across as unwilling or unable to change from that. Moreover, the claim that the documentary lacked context is particularly egregious given the documentary's focus on the human impact of Israel's policies and from the eyes of the kids living through it at that. The film was not intended to be a comprehensive history of this genocide, but rather an examination of how ordinary Palestinians, children notably, navigate the trauma and deprivation imposed by occupation and war. By demanding context, in this case, the BBC is effectively imposing an impossible standard upon itself, as a get-out clause that undermines the value of both their ability to produce world-class documentaries combined with human empathy in journalism, when the standard of journalism at the BBC, for as good as their documentaries are, is rock bottom and completely compromised by pro-Israel bias and pressure from government and outside groups, but also from within. One such figure whose name has risen to some prominence in recent weeks in relation to the BBC's news output and the language used and the pro-Israeli narrative constantly being pushed is Rafi Berg, the BBC's Middle East editor, who has been accused of downplaying Israeli violence and amplifying narratives that justify Israel's actions. Berg's influence within the BBC has reportedly contributed to a culture of self-censorship, where journalists and producers are discouraged from covering Palestinian issues in a way that might be perceived as critical of Israel. Certain wording is forbidden, and when Israel are the perpetrators of a genocide, and the BBC can't even use the word genocide, this is an unforgivable failure of what is supposed to be the most trusted news outlet in the UK. Now one of the worst, and more people in the UK increasingly know it. This internal bias has created an environment where stories like this one, even told as it is by children, is seen as too controversial, too risky, even when they adhere to the highest standards of journalistic integrity, and that makes the BBC weak and untrustworthy. The controversy surrounding the BBC's decision has also drawn attention to the political dimensions of the issue as well, particularly the role of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in all of this. During his recent visit to the White House, Starmer expressed concerns about the pro-Palestine bias at the BBC, a statement that's been widely ridiculed given the overwhelming evidence of the broadcaster's pro-Israel slant, and which is in no small part due to Starmer's government leaning on them as well, as governments always tend to do. Starmer will always attempt to align himself with pro-Israel interests because they fund him. He owes the Israel lobby everything, and his rancid party duly follows suit as well. Many other ministers in his government also benefiting from having received pro-Israel donations. Starmer's visit to the White House was itself a source of embarrassment, though. Karma for Keith, and you can, well, see why here.
The BBC has today admitted serious flaws over the recent Gaza coverage, suggestions of payments made to people linked to Hamas. Does the BBC still have your trust? Thank you.
Well, they didn't do well with President Obama. He'd never got a lot of things done, and he didn't get a trade deal done that was of any importance or magnitude. We've had great discussions on trade, and I think we're going to have a deal done rather quickly as it can be done. We're going to have something, I think, rather quickly. We expect to do that. Okay? Please.
On the BBC, look, I've been concerned about the programme in question. The Secretary of State had a meeting with the BBC. I think it was yesterday, it could have been the day before. Thank you. You mentioned Canada. I think you're trying to find a divide between us that doesn't exist. We're the closest of nations, and we had very good discussions today, but we didn't discuss Canada.
Thank you. Please. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes. Thank you.
If you wanted a perfect example of the influence Starmer has on Trump, it got summed up pretty much by Trump saying that's enough and cutting him off, at which point he meekly buttons it. But the more disturbing part, apart from Trump going off on a bizarre tangent about Obama, was Starmer stating that the government had spoken to the BBC on the matter of this documentary. So were the BBC ordered to pull it by the Minister for Culture, Media and Sport, Lisa Nandy, then? More questions have been raised on that, and they need answering. Trump's dismissive attitude towards Starmer, though, reinforces a widespread belief that Starmer simply can't assert himself on the international stage, is a weak and largely incoherent individual, as well as being sickeningly sycophantic there. Ultimately, though, this controversy over Gaza, how to survive a war zone, has shone a big fat spotlight on issues of media bias in coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict and government involvement in that, our government, as well as by other factors both outside and inside the BBC. By removing this documentary, the BBC has reinforced the perception that mainstream media outlets are unwilling or unable to challenge the dominant narratives that favour Israel and marginalised Palestinians. Therefore, the support for independent and alternative media who cannot be lent on in the same way, or who refuse to be, is all the more important. So do make sure you support your favourite outlets however you can. For more on this story, please do check out my other video on the axing of this documentary as my video recommendation for you here as your suggested next watch. Please do hit like, share and subscribe before you do so, though, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content dropping. Plus it supports the channel at the same time, which is all rather clever and massively appreciated. And I will hopefully therefore catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.